I never thought I'd see the day when my own son would look me in the eye and tell me I was no longer welcome in the house I built. But there I was, standing on the front porch of my old home in Jacksonville, the Florida sun beating down on my back, while Daniel, my firstborn, my pride, blocked the doorway like I was some stranger trying to sell him a vacuum cleaner. "Dad, it's not a good time," he said, his hand gripping the edge of the door. His voice was tight, the way it gets when he's trying to stay polite but doesn't really care if he's rude. Behind him, I could hear laughter, plates clinking, the hum of conversation. I leaned forward, just enough to peek past his shoulder. They were all in there. My children, my grandchildren, even cousins I hadn't seen in years. A long dining table was set up in the living room, decorated with flowers, candles, and enough food to feed a wedding party. I swallowed hard. "Not a good time?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "It's your mother's birthday. You think she wouldn't want me here?" Daniel's eyes flicked to the side, toward someone inside. Then, without looking at me, he muttered, "This was kind of a family thing. Family thing." I opened my mouth to speak, but that's when I saw her, Claire, my daughter, standing in the hallway, arms crossed, smirking like she'd been waiting for this moment. She leaned against the wall and called out just loud enough for me to hear, "Dad, we didn't invite you. Thought it'd be less awkward this way. Less awkward." The words landed like a punch. For a moment, I didn't move, didn't breathe. The heat, the laughter behind them, the smell of roasted chicken drifting out the door. It all seemed to blur. My grip tightened around the envelope in my hand, the one I'd been holding onto for weeks. Inside it was something important, something they thought they were entitled to. Daniel stepped forward, trying to close the door, but I put my hand out against the frame. "You're telling me my own children threw a party for their mother in the house I paid for, with the money I earned, and I'm not welcome?" Claire's smirk deepened. "You don't live here anymore, Dad. Things change. Things change." That was their way of saying they'd moved on from me, that I was no longer needed, no longer part of their picture. I stared at them for a long moment, then slowly let my hand drop from the doorframe. Daniel shut the door, the click of the lock sounding louder than any slam could have. The envelope felt heavier in my hand. I looked down at it. Cream paper, my handwriting on the front. I'd been ready to hand it over tonight, thinking it would be a small gesture to remind them I still cared. But now I knew better. They thought they could write me out of their lives, but they had no idea, absolutely no idea, that I had already decided to rewrite theirs. The truth is, this didn't happen overnight. This betrayal, this ice-cold dismissal, had been brewing for years. And if you really want to understand why I stood there that night, watching the sun set on whatever relationship I had left with my children, you need to know how it all began. It started almost 10 years ago, when I first noticed the shift. Back then, I was still working part-time, even though most men my age were well into their retirement. I liked staying busy, kept me sharp, and I thought my children respected that. But slowly, the calls started coming less often. Family dinners turned into, "We'll see if we can make it," and visits. Well, those became rare enough to count on one hand. At first, I made excuses for them. Daniel had his business. Claire had the twins. Life gets busy. I understood that. But then came the first real slap in the face. When my brother died, and neither of them showed up to the funeral. Daniel sent flowers. Claire sent a text. I remember sitting alone in the front pew, staring at the altar, wondering how I'd raised children who could be so detached. I told myself it was just bad timing, that there was some kind of emergency. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The years that followed only proved me right. Little by little, I became less of a father and more of a background character in their lives. They called when they needed something, advice, a cosigner, a loan. But when I needed them, silence. Still, I tried. Birthdays, Christmas, Easter, I showed up. I gave gifts. I kept the traditions alive even when it felt like I was the only one who cared. And the truth is, I didn't mind giving. I've always been generous. But generosity without respect is just being used. Then, about a year ago, the will came up in conversation. I hadn't updated it in years, and my lawyer suggested it was time. I mentioned this to Daniel over lunch one day, thinking it was just small talk. But the way his eyes lit up, it made my stomach turn. From that moment on, everything changed. Suddenly, I was getting more calls, more visits. Claire started bringing the kids over, just to see Grandpa. Teeth. Daniel invited me to dinners, bought me drinks, asked me about my health like he was taking inventory. At first, I let myself believe they'd finally come around, that maybe they'd realized family mattered more than anything. But the truth slapped me across the face one night, when I overheard Daniel talking to his wife in the kitchen. "He's not getting any younger," he said. "Once the will's sorted, we'll be set. Just gotta make sure he doesn't change his mind." That was the night I decided to test them. I told them I'd finalized the will, that everything was locked in. I watched their faces closely, and I saw it. That flicker of relief, that greedy little glint in their eyes. They had no idea the ink on that paper told a very different story. And now, standing outside my old home, holding that envelope, I realized the final piece of my plan had just fallen into place. They thought they were in control. They thought they'd won, but I'd been patient. I'd been quiet. And now it was my turn. I was 23 years old when I first held Daniel in my arms. It was the middle of a sweltering Jacksonville summer, the kind where the air sticks to your skin. But all I felt was a strange, cooling stillness. When I looked into those tiny blue eyes, he had my nose, my stubborn jaw, and he gripped my finger with a strength that made me laugh through my exhaustion. 3 years later, Claire came along, loud and demanding from the first breath. She had her mother's dark hair and a set of lungs that could shatter glass. But when she quieted, she'd curl into my chest like she was meant to be there. I used to think those moments were the reason I worked so hard, to give them the life they deserved. I wasn't born into wealth. My father was a mechanic, my mother a school secretary. We had food, but never extras. So when I graduated high school, I went straight into the Navy. It gave me discipline, purpose, and just enough savings to get into construction after I got out. By the time Daniel was born, I was running my own small contracting company, the kind that worked long days and longer nights. There were times I'd come home covered in drywall dust and paint, my back screaming, my hands raw, only to find the kids already asleep. I hated missing those hours, but every nail I drove into a wall felt like it was for them. The braces on Daniel's teeth, the piano lessons Claire begged for, the vacations their mother loved to plan. Disney, Myrtle Beach, the Keys. We didn't just have a house. We had a home. And I built it myself. Literally. The brick 2-story on Magnolia Drive was my pride. I spent months designing it, poured the foundation with my own crew, laid the floors by hand. Every corner of that place had a piece of me in it. The front porch swing where Daniel fell asleep on my lap during summer storms. The backyard where Claire learned to ride her bike, wobbling between my hands until she found her balance. But somewhere along the way, that home became theirs, not ours. I first noticed the change when Daniel turned 30. By then, his mother and I had divorced, but we stayed civil for the kids. Daniel was married, running a small insurance business. Claire had graduated college and was working at a marketing firm. I was proud of them both, but I started to see cracks in the way they looked at me. It began with the little things. Daniel making jokes about my old truck when we met for lunch. Claire sighing when I asked her to help me with a new smartphone. They weren't mean exactly, but there was a tone, a subtle roll of the eyes, like I was an antique they didn't quite know what to do with. Still, I brushed it off. They were young, busy. The world was moving fast, and I was slowing down. Then came the first real test. Claire wanted to buy a condo downtown but didn't have enough for the down payment. I offered to help, not as a gift, but a loan. I even drew up a simple agreement, nothing fancy, just so we'd both feel secure. She signed it, thanked me, promised she'd pay me back within 2 years. 5 years later, I'd never seen a dime. Whenever I brought it up, she'd laugh and say, "Oh, Dad, don't worry. You don't need." Daniel's turn came not long after. His business hit a slow patch, and he asked if I could co-sign a loan so he could expand. I hesitated, but in the end, I said yes. A father wants to see his son succeed. Months later, I found out he'd used part of that money for a week-long trip to Cabo with his wife. When I confronted him, he shrugged. It was a business thing, too. Networking. You wouldn't get it. That one stung. It wasn't just the money. It was the casual dismissal. The way they acted as if my sacrifices were part of the natural order of things. Expected, owed. Over time, they stopped asking how I was doing and started asking what I could do for them. Need a babysitter? Call Dad. Need help moving? Call Dad. Need someone to fix the leaking faucet or patch the drywall? Call Dad. And I came, every time, because that's what fathers do. But the thanks were different, less heartfelt, more transactional. A quick "appreciate it" before they turned back to their phones. Sometimes I'd leave their houses and realize I hadn't had a single real conversation with them the entire visit. Then there were the humiliations. One Christmas, Daniel hosted dinner at his place. I arrived with a bottle of wine, wearing the same suit I'd worn to his wedding. Navy blue, still pressed. As soon as I walked in, his wife looked me up and down and said, "Oh, Mitchell, you're so traditional." I smiled politely, but I caught Claire smirking behind her glass. Another time at a barbecue, Daniel introduced me to one of his friends as the guy who built our old house. Not his father. Not the man who'd raised him. Just the guy. Like I was some contractor they'd hired once. I told myself not to read too much into it, but those moments piled up like bricks on my chest. And then, slowly, I began to see something uglier. When their mother's health started to decline, the conversations shifted to her estate. She had remarried years ago, and her new husband had no children of his own. It wasn't long before I overheard Daniel and Claire speculating about what she might leave them. Not in a hopeful way, in an entitled one, as if it was their due. Between Mom's place and whatever Dad's got, we'll be fine, I once heard Daniel say at a family barbecue. He didn't know I was standing behind the open kitchen door. Claire laughed and said, "Yeah, Dad's house alone is worth a fortune. He better not get any ideas about giving it away to charity or something." It was like being gutted with a dull knife. I had spent my entire life believing love was enough. That if I showed up, worked hard, and gave everything I had, my children would carry that love in their bones. But what I saw in that moment wasn't love. It was calculation. From then on, I started noticing every subtle manipulation. The way Daniel would drop by just when my quarterly investment statements arrived in the mail. The way Claire suddenly became interested in bonding time whenever tax season rolled around. One night, I decided to test them. I told them I'd been to the doctor and the news wasn't great. Nothing specific, just tests and follow-ups. Within a week, they were calling more often, visiting more, asking about my will in the gentlest, most rehearsed ways possible. "Just want to make sure you've got everything in order," Claire said over coffee one morning. Her hand was on my arm, but her eyes were scanning my kitchen like she was mentally appraising the appliance. Daniel was more direct. "You should lock that stuff down now. Makes it easier for everyone later. No surprises." No surprises. That's when the idea first took root. The idea that maybe I didn't need to play the role they'd cast me in. Maybe I could write my own ending. But before I made any decisions, I kept watching, kept collecting moments. The final straw came last spring, at Claire's birthday dinner. It was at a fancy restaurant downtown. the kind with dim lighting and white tablecloths. I'd offered to pay for the meal, thinking it would be my gift to her. But when the bill came, Daniel reached for it first. "Don't worry, Dad," he said with a grin. "We've got this." I should have been touched, but when the waiter returned the check, I caught a glimpse of the card, my old company card, the one I'd let Daniel use for emergencies years ago. He'd never given it back. Claire raised her glass. "See, Dad? We take care of you, too." I smiled, because that's what you do in public. But inside, something shifted. It was subtle, like the first cool breeze before a storm, but it was there. I went home that night, sat in my recliner, and stared at the framed photo of the four of us taken in front of the house on Magnolia Drive. Daniel's arm around his mother, Claire grinning at the camera, me standing behind them, my hands on their shoulders. In that moment, I realized something I should have seen years ago. They didn't see me as a father anymore. They saw me as a resource, a bank, a man whose value was measured by what he could give them. And people like that, they don't just take. They take until there's nothing left. So I made a decision. From that day forward, I would stop playing the part they'd written for me. I wouldn't fight them head-on. That would only make me look bitter. No, I would do what I'd always done best. Work quietly, steadily, until the structure was ready. And when it was time, I'd pull the right beam, and the whole thing would come down. They wouldn't see it coming. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, one of those clear, bright Jacksonville days when the sunlight bounces off every windshield and the air smells faintly of salt from the river. I'd been running errands, nothing major, just groceries and a stop by the bank. When I got home, there was an envelope taped to my front door. It was thin, white, and official-looking, my name printed neatly in block letters. At first, I thought it might be a notice from the HOA, but when I tore it open and started reading, my chest tightened. It wasn't from the HOA. It was from a law firm. According to the letter, the ownership of the Magnolia Drive house, my house, had been legally transferred to Daniel 6 months ago. The document claimed it had been a gift, a transfer of property, in recognition of family loyalty and support. There was even a signature that looked like mine at the bottom, only it wasn't mine. The letter went on to explain that I had 30 days to vacate the premises because Daniel and his wife required the home for personal use. I stood there, the paper shaking in my hands, my eyes blurring as I tried to read the same sentence over and over. This wasn't possible. This was my house, my foundation, my floors, my blood in every nail and beam. I'd never signed it away. I drove straight to Daniel's office. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth. When I walked in, his receptionist's smile faltered. Mr. Jadowski? Daniel's in a meeting. Tell him his father is here," I said, my voice low enough to make her swallow hard. 5 minutes later, he came out, looking perfectly calm in his tailored suit. "Dad," he said, like I was an unexpected guest he wasn't sure he wanted to see. "What's going on?" I held up the letter. "You want to explain this?" He took it, glanced at it, and then handed it back like it was nothing more than a parking ticket. "It's just the paperwork catching up. We talked about this months ago." "No," I said, stepping closer. "We didn't. I never signed anything." He smiled. A tight, dismissive smile I'd seen him use on insurance clients he didn't respect. "You must be forgetting. It was right after Mom's birthday dinner. You said you wanted the house to stay in the family, and you didn't want to deal with upkeep anymore. I took care of the rest." I stared at him. "That's a lie." "Dad?" He sighed, glancing toward his office like he had more important things to do. "Look, you're 71. You don't need all that space. Claire and I agreed it was best to make sure it's taken care of. You can use the next month to find a nice condo. Something easy." The way he said it, "something easy," made my skin crawl. "I built that house," I said quietly, "with my hands. I raised you there." Daniel's eyes were cool, flat. "And now it's mine. That's how life works, Dad. things change. It felt like a punch to the chest. I left before I did something I couldn't take back. My hands were trembling on the steering wheel all the way home. I kept telling myself there had to be a mistake, a way to fix it. But when I called a lawyer that evening, the news was worse. The signature had been notarized. The transfer was filed with the county. It would take months, maybe years, to fight it. And even then, the odds were slim. Without proof of fraud, the law was on Daniel's side. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him leaning back in his chair, telling me I didn't need all that space. The weeks that followed were a blur of boxes and quiet rage. I packed up decades of my life. The hand-carved table from my Navy days, the photos of the kids at the beach, the worn recliner where I'd fallen asleep more times than I could count. Claire came by once. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, and said, "It's for the best, Dad. That house needs younger energy. You'll be happier somewhere smaller." I didn't answer. I just kept wrapping dishes in newspaper. The move-out day was worse than I'd imagined. Daniel had arranged for a moving truck, but not for me, for his own things. As I loaded the last of my boxes into my pickup, another truck pulled up, and two men began unloading brand-new furniture. A sleek white sectional, a marble coffee table, abstract paintings in gold frames. It was like watching someone redecorate your memory. Neighbors stopped by, not to help, but to watch. Mrs. Turner from across the street asked, "Oh, Mitchell, I didn't know you were moving. Is everything all right?" Before I could answer, Daniel stepped in, his hand on her shoulder. "Dad's downsizing," he said with a grin, finally taking it easy. The humiliation burned in my throat. By late afternoon, my house no longer looked like mine. The swing on the porch was gone. The family photos had been replaced with generic artwork. Even the curtains were different. When I went inside to get the last box from the kitchen, I found Daniel and Claire in the dining room, standing over the long oak table I'd built myself. "Once we redo this place, it'll be perfect," Claire was saying. Daniel nodded. "Yeah. And if we sell in a few years, we'll make a killing." They didn't see me standing there, or maybe they didn't care. I left without saying goodbye. I ended up in a small one-bedroom apartment overlooking a strip mall. The walls were thin, the carpet smelled faintly of cigarettes, and the balcony faced a parking lot where teenagers hung out at night. The first week, I tried to settle in. I unpacked the essentials, made coffee in the mornings, took walks around the block, but nothing felt right. The air didn't smell like my yard. The sounds at night weren't the crickets and distant trains I'd known for decades. They were muffled TV sets, car alarms, and the hum of an air conditioner that never shut off. And then came the birthday party. It was for their mother, my ex-wife. They were hosting it at Magnolia Drive. I wasn't invited, but I told myself I'd drop by anyway, just to see her, just to wish her well. She and I had our differences, but 40 years of history counts for something. I drove over as the sun was setting, the sky painted in orange and pink streaks. I parked down the street, walked up the driveway, and knocked on the door. Daniel answered. The noise of the party spilled out. Laughter, clinking glasses, music. I could see the glow of the dining room chandelier, the long table covered in food. "Not a good time, Dad," he said, his hand braced against the doorframe. I leaned just enough to see inside. Claire was there, wearing a bright red dress, holding a glass of wine. When she saw me, she smiled. Not warmly, but the way you smile at a stranger in a store you don't want to talk to. "Dad," she called out, "we didn't invite you. Thought it'd be less awkward this way." The words sliced clean through me. Behind her, people were laughing, talking, eating at the table I'd once built for family dinners. My ex-wife was there too, smiling at something Daniel had said, like I didn't exist. Daniel stepped forward, and I caught the faint scent of his cologne. "We'll call you next week," he said. "Okay?" I looked at him, then at Claire, then at the warm light spilling from my old home into the cool evening air. My throat felt tight, my chest heavy. I nodded once, stepped back, and let him close the door. The click of the lock was louder than the music inside. I walked slowly back to my truck, the gravel crunching under my shoes. The envelope I'd brought with me, the one I'd been meaning to give them, was still in my hand. I stared at it for a moment before slipping it into my jacket pocket. On the drive back to my apartment, the streets blurred past in streaks of yellow and red from the traffic lights. I barely noticed them. When I got home, I set the envelope on the kitchen counter and turned off every light in the apartment. I sat in the dark, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, staring at the faint outline of that envelope in the shadows. I didn't need to open it. I already knew what was inside. And I already knew what I was going to do with it. I didn't act right away. That's not my way. When you've built houses from the ground up, you learn that rushing only leads to cracks. Revenge is the same. You start with the foundation, hidden beneath the surface, where no one can see it forming. My first move wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no confrontation, just a quiet call to my lawyer. I still had accounts in my name, investments, a trust I'd set up years ago for future family needs. The same trust Daniel and Claire thought they'd inherit someday. They assumed it was sitting there, untouched, waiting for them. It wasn't. 2 weeks after that night on the porch, I transferred every cent from the trust into a private account under a different entity. Clean, legal, invisible. On paper, the trust was empty. The next quarterly statement would make their eyes widen. But I didn't stop there. I also still had joint ownership of a small piece of commercial property Daniel used for his insurance business, an office condo I'd bought years ago when he was starting out. His name was on the door, but mine was on the deed. That meant I had certain rights. I didn't evict him, not yet. That would have been too obvious. Instead, I called the management company and told them I wanted to renegotiate the lease term. Higher monthly fees, stricter parking rules, mandatory maintenance inspections, all perfectly standard, but enough to tighten the noose just a little. A week later, Daniel called me. "Dad, what's going on with the office lease?" "The management company said you signed off on these changes." I kept my voice calm, just making sure the property's kept in good shape. You know how it is. Upkeep costs more these days. There was a pause. "Yeah, but it's kind of a big jump. You could have given me a heads up." "Daniel," I said, "you didn't give me a heads up when you took my house. I figured we were past that kind of courtesy." The silence on the other end was almost sweet. Finally, he muttered something about talking later, and hung up. My second move was even smaller, but it struck closer to their pride. Daniel and Claire both loved appearances. Social media posts, holiday parties, charity events. They thrived on looking like the perfect, well-connected family. And nothing made them prouder than being members of the local yacht club. Membership there wasn't cheap. I'd been a member for decades, and when the kids got older, I sponsored their application. What they didn't realize was that the club had strict rules. A sponsor could revoke support if a member was found to have acted in a way that disgraced the values of the institution. It took one meeting with the club president, an old fishing buddy of mine, to quietly explain how my children had mishandled family affairs. I didn't embellish much. I didn't have to. The truth was enough. 2 weeks later, Daniel called again. "They're reviewing our membership," he said, his voice tight. "Did you talk to someone?" I let a beat pass. "I told them the truth, son. How you handled the house situation, how you treated me. That's not how it—" He stopped himself. "Dad, you can't just—" "I can," I said softly. And I did. This time, he didn't hang up. He just breathed into the phone for a few seconds before saying, "You're making a mistake." And then the line went dead. The third move wasn't about money or status. It was about planting a seed of doubt. I started with Claire. She'd been dating a man named Robert for the past year. A slick, charming guy who always seemed just a little too interested in my financial situation. He'd tried to corner me once at a family gathering, asking casual questions about estate planning while refilling my wine glass. One afternoon, I ran into him downtown. He didn't see me at first, but I saw him, standing outside a cafe, leaning a little too close to a woman who definitely wasn't Claire. Their body language wasn't old friends catching up. I didn't confront him. That would have been messy, and frankly, unnecessary. Instead, I made sure Claire happened to see the same scene for herself. It wasn't hard. I invited her to lunch at that cafe a few days later, timed perfectly, so Robert and his mystery woman would be at their usual table. I watched Claire's smile falter as her eyes locked on them. "Something wrong?" I asked, sipping my coffee. She didn't answer right away. She just stared, her jaw tightening. The beauty of it was that I didn't need to say a word. The image would stay with her. She'd start asking herself questions, maybe even confronting him. And when trust begins to crack, it never quite holds the same weight again. None of these moves were big enough to set off alarms. To Daniel and Claire, they were just inconvenience, unfortunate coincidence. But I could feel the balance shifting, just slightly, in my direction. I could see it in Daniel's eyes when we ran into each other at the grocery store, that flicker of uncertainty, the unspoken question of what I might do next. I could see it in Claire's clipped texts, the way her messages got shorter, less friendly. I wasn't trying to destroy them, not yet. I was just making them uncomfortable, taking back a little control at a time. The turning point came at a neighborhood fundraiser. It was one of those events where everyone wore pressed linen shirts and pretended to be deeply moved by silent auction items. Daniel and Claire were there, of course, working the crowd. They hadn't seen me walk in. I stayed near the back, talking to a few old friends. Then, during the raffle announcements, the MC made a point of thanking longtime community supporter Mitchell Jadowski for his generous anonymous donation. Heads turned. People clapped. I caught Daniel's eye across the room. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Because he knew. He knew that no one had thanked him. That the whispers that followed, "Isn't that his father?" weren't about him. For once, he wasn't the center of the story. I was. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger, not bitterness, but a steady, quiet satisfaction. That night, back in my apartment, I poured myself a glass of bourbon and sat by the window. The parking lot below was quiet for once. I thought about the moves I'd made. Small things, subtle shifts, but already they were working. Daniel's confidence was showing cracks. Claire was distracted, her perfect little image blurring at the edges. They thought they'd taken everything from me, but I was only just getting started. And from here on out, every move would be bigger. It didn't take long for Daniel to push back. 2 weeks after the fundraiser, I got a letter from his lawyer. This one wasn't about the house. It was about the commercial property, the office space his business ran out of. According to the letter, Daniel was exercising his right to buy me out of my share at a fair market value. The problem? The valuation he'd submitted was laughably low, barely a third of what the property was worth. In other words, he was trying to steal it, just like he stole the house. I called the lawyer listed on the letter, a man named Caldwell. His tone was smooth, but sharp. "Mr. Jadowski, my client is simply trying to streamline ownership. We'd like to avoid unnecessary legal complications." I almost laughed. "Tell your client I'm not selling." There was a pause. Then, "If you refuse, we'll proceed with a partition action. It's a matter of time before the court forces a sale." It was a power play, a way to box me into a corner. And for most people, it would have worked. But Daniel had forgotten something. Years ago, when I bought that office space for him, I also bought the unit next to it. Smaller, cheaper, but connected by a shared wall. I'd rented it out for years to a loyal tenant, a retired CPA named Harris, who'd become a friend. Quiet man, but sharp as a tack. And Harris still had every piece of paperwork from his own purchase, including a little-known easement agreement that had been signed before Daniel ever moved in. The agreement gave me final say over any structural changes to either unit, including mergers, remodels, or expansion. If Daniel wanted to renovate or modernize his space, And he always did. He needed my approval. And if he lost that ability, the property's value would plummet. I didn't threaten him directly. That would have been too easy to trace back. Instead, I met with Harris, explained the situation, and had him quietly file a notice with the county reaffirming the easement. Public record. Perfectly legal. 2 days later, Daniel called me. "What the hell are you doing?" His voice was tight, clipped. "The contractor says we can't start the remodel because of some ancient easement. Did you—" "I didn't create it, son," I said. "It's been there for decades. I guess you just never bothered to read the fine print. You're doing this on purpose." I didn't deny it. That's when Claire stepped in. I got an email from her, short, polished, and dripping with faux concern. She said she'd been reviewing some family matters and noticed discrepancies in my will. She suggested we meet to make sure everything was in order. When I didn't respond, she showed up at my apartment unannounced. "Dad," she began, sitting across from me at my small kitchen table, "we just want to make sure things are clear. No misunderstandings later." I sipped my coffee, letting the silence stretch. Finally, she leaned forward. "You know, if you leave things messy, it could get tied up in probate for years. That's not what you want, is it?" There it was, the threat disguised as concern. I set my cup down. "Claire, do you remember when you borrowed money for that condo?" She blinked. "What does that have to do with—" "You signed a repayment agreement. I still have it. Never saw a dime back. But I kept it." Her smile faltered. "And do you remember," I continued, "telling me that Robert was the best man you'd ever met? I wonder what you'd think if you knew where I saw him the other week." The color drained from her face. I didn't have to say more. Seeds grow best in silence. The real twist, though, had been in motion long before any of this started. Months before Daniel took the house, before the party, before the eviction notice, I'd met with my estate lawyer. We'd rewritten everything, every trust, every deed, every designation of beneficiary. On paper, it looked like I'd left them the bulk of my estate. But in reality, the assets they thought were waiting for them had been moved into a charitable foundation I'd established under my own name. The foundation had one special clause. The board would be controlled by 3 people: me, Harris, and an old Navy buddy of mine, both of them loyal as they come. Upon my passing, the foundation would continue operating, using the assets to fund scholarships for kids in Jacksonville whose families had never owned property. Not a cent would go to Daniel or Claire. They didn't know it yet, but they would. The moment came sooner than I expected. Daniel invited me to a family mediation, clearly his idea of a truce. We met at a sleek law office downtown, the kind with chrome fixtures and coffee that tastes like burnt almonds. He was already there with Claire, both dressed like they were attending a business luncheon. His lawyer was seated between them, shuffling papers. "Dad," Daniel began, "we just want to settle everything. Clean slate. You sign over your share of the commercial property. Update your will to reflect the original plan. And in return, we guarantee you lifetime financial support." Claire smiled like she was handing me a gift. I leaned back in my chair. "That's generous." "It's fair," Daniel said. "You don't have to worry about anything again." I looked between them, let a small smile form. "Funny. I don't worry now." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" I reached into my jacket and pulled out a single folded document. It wasn't the will. Not exactly. It was a notarized summary of the foundation, listing its assets, board members, and mission. I slid it across the table. They read the first line, then the second. Claire's face went pale. Daniel's jaw tightened. "This isn't—" he started. "It is," I said. "And it's already filed with the state. Every account, every property, every asset you thought was yours isn't. You took my house. You tried to take my business. I decided to take your future." The lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Daniel leaned forward, his voice low. "Dangerous. You'll regret this." I met his gaze and let the silence hang until it became heavier than words. Then I said, just loud enough for both of them to hear, "No, son, you will." 2 months passed without a word from Daniel or Claire. No calls, no emails, no chance encounters. I knew what they were doing. Regrouping, waiting for an opportunity to strike. They'd probably convinced themselves that my foundation reveal was just a bluff, a scare tactic from an old man who didn't have the stomach for a real fight. Then, one Friday morning, an embossed envelope arrived in my mailbox. It was an invitation. Daniel and Claire were honoring their late mother's memory with a charity dinner at the Magnolia Drive house, my house. The event was open to close family and select community members, which meant it would be full of their social circle, business contacts, and the people they most wanted to impress. And at the bottom, in elegant cursive, was a line that made me chuckle out loud. "We are proud to announce the formal presentation of our inheritance plans, ensuring our family's legacy continues for generations." There it was. The gloat. They wanted me there, not to include me, but to parade me as the aging patriarch passing the torch, to show the world they'd taken care of Dad while quietly securing everything for themselves. I RSVP'd the same day. The night of the dinner, I wore my best suit, navy blue, freshly pressed, the same one Daniel had once called traditional, with a smirk. I arrived right on time, stepping into the glow of my old home's chandeliers. It was surreal. The rooms looked the same in shape, but not in spirit. My worn oak floors had been sanded and polished to a high shine. The walls were covered with staged artwork, all color and no soul. The smell of lemon polish hung in the air, replacing the faint scent of wood and old books that used to linger here. Daniel spotted me first. "Dad!" he called out, his smile wide, his voice just a shade too loud. He shook my hand in front of half the room, as if we were partners rather than opponents. Claire floated over in a sequined dress, kissing my cheek. "So glad you came," she said sweetly, gripping my arm just tight enough to remind me she wanted control of this moment. "Wouldn't miss it," I said. Dinner was a performance. Daniel at the head of the table, Claire to his right, me placed halfway down like a prop in their tableau. They told stories about our family legacy, sprinkled with just enough truth to keep the guests nodding along. I watched them, noting every detail. The way Daniel's chest swelled when he talked about his property investment. The way Claire's smile widened when someone mentioned her inheritance security. Finally, as dessert plates were cleared, Daniel stood. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he began, his voice rich with self-importance. "As many of you know, our mother always believed in family first, and Claire and I are proud to carry that forward. That's why, after years of planning, we're ready to share something special with you all." He reached for a leather folder on the sideboard and pulled out a thick document. "These," he said, holding them aloft, "are the final plans for the Jadowski family estate. Assets, properties, trusts, all aligned to ensure this legacy stays strong for generations to come." Polite applause rippled through the room. Claire chimed in, her voice warm. "And of course, our father is fully on board. We've made sure his needs will be taken care of for the rest of his life." A few heads turned toward me. Smiling, I stood. "Yes," I said, "I am on board. In fact, I'd like to make my own announcement tonight, if my children don't mind." Daniel's eyes narrowed, but he gestured magnanimously. "Of course, Dad." I walked to the head of the table, standing just beside him. My hands were steady, my voice calm. "I've been thinking a lot about legacy," I began. "Not just what we leave behind, but how we're remembered. And I've realized things aren't always as they seem." From my inside pocket, I pulled a single envelope, cream-colored, thick, with my handwriting on the front. The same envelope I'd carried the night they locked me out of this house. "This," I said, holding it up, "is the true final plan for the Jadowski family estate." The room went quiet. I opened the envelope and drew out a single sheet, a notarized statement from the state of Florida, confirming the registration and asset list of the Mitchell Jadowski Foundation. I read aloud, "Upon my passing, All personal assets, including but not limited to real estate, investments, and liquid funds, will be transferred to the Mitchell-Jadowski Foundation for the purpose of funding scholarships, housing programs, and community initiatives in Jacksonville. I looked up, meeting Daniel's eyes. Not 1 cent will go to my children. Gasps scattered through the room. Daniel's face went red. This is some stunt. It's public record, I said calmly. Anyone can verify it. Claire's voice was sharper. You can't just... I can, I said, cutting her off. And I have. I let the silence settle. Every guest was watching now, some shifting uncomfortably, others clearly enjoying the show. I continued, my tone still even. Daniel and Claire have worked very hard these last few years, not at building their own legacy, but at dismantling mine. They took my home without my consent. They tried to force me out of my business. They've lied, manipulated, and treated me not as a father, but as a wallet. A murmur ran through the crowd. Daniel's jaw clenched. But here's the thing about building something, I said. If you do it right, you control the foundation. And when you control the foundation, you decide who lives in the house and who's left standing outside. I looked at Daniel. You locked me out once. Now it's your turn to stand on the porch. Daniel stepped toward me, his voice low but audible to everyone. You think this makes you the bigger man? No, I said, meeting his glare. It makes me the man who finally stopped mistaking blood for family. That landed. He froze. Claire looked away, her lips pressed tight. I didn't linger. I placed the statement on the table, nodded to the guests, and walked out the front door. The cool night air hit my face, and I realized I was smiling. Not the bitter smile I'd worn for years, but something lighter. As I reached my car, I could still hear the muffled sounds of voices inside, confusion, whispers, the brittle clink of glasses. I knew that from this night on, their story about taking care of Dad would fall apart. People talk. Reputations crack. And for Daniel and Claire, appearances were everything. I started the engine, the headlights washing over the familiar street. For the first time in a long while, Magnolia Drive didn't feel like home, and that was fine by me. Because home, I'd learned, isn't a place. It's the peace you carry when you know you've taken back what was yours all along. News travels fast in a city like Jacksonville, especially in the circles Daniel and Claire moved in. Within a week of the dinner, I'd heard from 3 different people that the big inheritance reveal had been the talk of the yacht club, the golf course, and even a few church luncheons. The story wasn't mine to spread. I didn't need to. People love a shift in power. And there's nothing quite as entertaining to onlookers as watching the golden children lose their shine. Daniel's business took the first hit. A longtime client pulled out of a major deal, citing a difference in value. Then the club membership review, the one I'd quietly set in motion months ago, came to a close. Membership revoked. No appeals. For Claire, it was subtler. A charity board she sat on decided to move in a different direction. Invitations to certain events stopped arriving. The smiles she got in public felt tighter, more polite. The kind you give someone you don't want to be seen standing next to for too long. I didn't revel in it, not outwardly. But there was a certain symmetry to it all. They'd built their image on taking from me. And now they were learning what it felt like when that image crumbled. For me, life got quieter, better. I started spending more time with Harris, helping him tinker with his boat down at the marina. Some evenings, I'd drive to the pier just before sunset, sit on the bench with a coffee, and watch the shrimp boats drift in, their nets heavy with the day's catch. One Saturday, my granddaughter, Daniel's oldest, showed up at my apartment unannounced. She stood there, shifting from foot to foot, before blurting, "I'm sorry for what Dad did." I invited her in, made her a cup of cocoa like I used to when she was little. We didn't talk much about Daniel or Claire. Instead, we talked about her plans for college, her love for marine biology, and the scholarship applications she was working on. A few weeks later, I quietly arranged for the foundation to set up a grant in her name, not because she was family by blood, but because she was trying to be someone better than the examples she'd been given. One evening, months after the dinner, I drove down Magnolia Drive, not to stop, just to see. The house looked the same from the outside. Same bricks, same porch, same swing hooks, though the swing was gone. The curtains were drawn, the light in the front room glowing faintly. For a moment, I thought about all the nights I'd stood at that window, watching the kids play in the yard, listening to the soft hum of life inside. And then I thought about the night I stood on that porch, unwelcome, the weight of the envelope in my hand, the sting of being shut out of something I had built. Funny thing was, the ache was gone. I didn't need that house anymore. I didn't need them to open the door, because somewhere along the way, I'd realized that legacy isn't about what you leave to people. It's about what you leave in people. And Daniel and Claire, they'd made their choices. My legacy would be carried forward by others. Strangers, students, families who'd never know my name, but would feel the ripple of what I'd set in motion. As I turned the corner and the house disappeared from view, I felt lighter. Life has a way of teaching lessons in its own time. Sometimes it's gentle, sometimes it's not. But in the end, respect, real respect, can't be bought, taken, or inherited. It's earned day by day in the way you treat people when you have nothing to gain. And if you forget that, sooner or later, life has a way of writing you out of the will.